Nobody ever warns you that the cruelest betrayal can come from someone you're supposed to call family, someone whose name you take when you say, I do. Hello everyone, I'm Grandma Dorothy, and I'm 75 years old, speaking to you from my cozy living room here in Bakersfield, California. This morning, as I was watering my petunias on the front porch, I watched a young couple moving into the house across the street, and it brought back memories that I've carried in silence for over 50 years. Some stories need to be told, not because they're easy to hear, but because someone out there might need to know they're not alone. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I was born Dorothy Mae Jensen in 1949, the middle child of 3 girls in a family that believed hard work was the answer to everything. My father William worked double shifts at the oil refinery, coming home each night with his clothes stained black and his hands permanently etched with grease lines that no amount of scrubbing could remove. My mother Marie took in laundry for the wealthier families on the hill, spending her days bent over steaming wash basins and ironing boards, her fingers cracked from lye soap, and her back aching from the endless cycle of other people's dirty clothes. Our house on Elm Street was a modest 2-bedroom with yellow siding that had faded to the color of old butter. The front yard was more dirt than grass, despite my mother's attempts to coax something green from the stubborn California soil. Inside, the furniture was worn but clean, second-hand pieces that told stories of other families before finding their way to ours. The kitchen table had ring stains from countless coffee cups, and the living room couch sagged in the middle where my father fell asleep every night after dinner, the evening paper spread across his chest. Money was always tight in the Jensen household. We shopped at the discount grocery store where the produce was slightly bruised, and the milk was always close to its expiration date. My mother darned our socks until they were more thread than original fabric, and our school clothes were carefully selected from the church donation box each fall. But we were loved, and we knew it. My parents may not have had much to give us materially, but they gave us something precious, the belief that we deserved respect and kindness. My older sister Linda was the responsible one, always helping with household chores and keeping my younger sister Beth and me in line when our parents were working. Linda had dreams of becoming a secretary, practicing her typing on an old manual typewriter she'd found at a garage sale. The keys stuck sometimes, but she'd pound away at it every evening after dinner, determined to build a better life for herself than the one she'd been born into. Beth, 3 years younger than me, was the family dreamer. She drew pictures constantly, covering every scrap of paper she could find with elaborate drawings of castles and princesses and faraway places she'd read about in library books. Our mother would pin her artwork to the refrigerator with pride, even though there was barely room for another drawing among the collection that covered every inch of the appliance. I fell somewhere between my sister's ambitions. I wasn't as practical as Linda or as artistic as Beth. I was just Dorothy, the girl who helped her mother with the laundry, who read romance novels borrowed from friends, who spent her evenings listening to the radio and imagining what it would be like to fall in love with someone who would take me away from the smell of lye soap and the sound of my father's exhausted snoring. School was my escape. I wasn't the smartest student, but I was dedicated, staying after class to ask questions and spending hours at the public library when home felt too small to contain my restless energy. My teachers encouraged me, especially Mrs. Patterson, who taught English literature and saw something in my compositions that I couldn't see myself. She would write encouraging notes in the margins of my essays, telling me I had a voice worth sharing with the world. When I graduated from high school in 1967, the world felt full of possibilities. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The country was changing, young people were demanding their voices be heard, and for the first time in my life, I felt like maybe I could be part of something bigger than laundry and factory work. I got a job at Woolworth's downtown, saving every penny I could in a coffee can hidden under my mattress, dreaming of maybe taking some classes at the community college or moving to Los Angeles where exciting things seemed to happen every day. It was at Woolworth's that I met Robert Crawford. He was 22, 3 years older than me, with sandy brown hair that fell across his forehead and green eyes that seemed to see right through to my soul. He worked at the Ford dealership down the street and would come in every Tuesday afternoon for a cherry Coke and a grilled cheese sandwich at the lunch counter. I served him week after week, my heart racing every time he smiled at me and asked how my day was going. Robert was different from the boys I'd gone to school with. He had ambition, plans for the future that extended beyond Bakersfield. He talked about eventually opening his own auto repair shop, maybe even expanding into selling cars. He dressed nicely, always clean and pressed, and he treated me like I was something special, something worth paying attention to. When he finally asked me out on a date, I felt like Cinderella being invited to the ball. Our courtship was sweet and innocent by today's standards. We went to movies at the drive-in, shared sodas at the diner, took long walks through the park while he told me about his dreams and I shared mine. He was respectful, never pushing for more than I was comfortable giving, and he made me laugh in ways I never had before. For the first time in my life I felt beautiful, cherished, like I mattered to someone beyond my usefulness with household chores. Robert lived with his parents in a larger house on the better side of town, a 2-story colonial with actual grass in the front yard and flowers planted in neat rows along the walkway. His mother Margaret was a petite woman who kept an immaculate house and seemed to glide rather than walk through the perfectly arranged rooms. She was polite to me when Robert brought me around, but there was something distant in her manner, as if she was evaluating me and finding me slightly lacking. His father Frank was a different story entirely. Frank Crawford was a big man, barrel-chested with thick arms and hands that looked like they could crush anything they closed around. He worked as a supervisor at the lumber mill and carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. When he spoke, people listened, not out of respect but out of something that felt more like fear. From the beginning, Frank made me uncomfortable in ways I couldn't quite articulate. He looked at me too long when he thought no one was watching, his eyes traveling up and down my body in a way that made my skin crawl. He stood too close when we were introduced, his hand lingering on mine during the handshake until I had to actively pull away. When I mentioned these feelings to Robert, he laughed them off as my imagination, telling me his father was just naturally intimidating but harmless underneath. Margaret, when I tried to share my discomfort with her, gave me a tight smile and changed the subject so quickly I wondered if I'd imagined the conversation entirely. Looking back now, I realize she knew exactly what kind of man she was married to, but like so many women of that era, she had learned to survive by keeping quiet and looking the other way. Robert and I were married in the spring of 1968, a small ceremony at the Methodist church with my family in the front pew wearing their best clothes, and his parents looking vaguely uncomfortable with the modest affair. I wore my mother's wedding dress, taken in to fit my smaller frame, and carried a bouquet of daisies from my mother's garden. As I walked down the aisle toward Robert's beaming face, I felt like my real life was finally beginning. The plan was for us to live with his parents for the first year or two while we saved money for our own place. It seemed practical at the time, especially since the Crawford house had plenty of room and Margaret had already prepared the guest bedroom for us with new curtains and a wedding ring quilt she'd made herself. What seemed like generosity then, I would later understand as the first link in a chain that would bind me to a nightmare I never could have imagined. The first few months of marriage were blissful, despite the living arrangements. Robert and I were deeply in love, planning our future and enjoying the newness of being husband and wife. I quit my job at Woolworth's to focus on being a homemaker, something that felt natural and right in those days. Margaret taught me her family recipes and showed me how she liked the house organized, and I threw myself into being the perfect daughter-in-law. Frank was often away during those early months, traveling for work or spending long hours at the mill. When he was home, he was mostly quiet, reading his newspaper in his favorite chair or working in the garage on various projects. I began to think my initial discomfort had been wedding nerves, that I'd imagined the inappropriate looks and comments. Robert seemed so happy, so proud to have me as his wife, and I wanted desperately to fit into his family the way he fit so naturally into mine. It was in late summer, about 4 months after our wedding, that everything changed. Robert had been called away on an emergency repair job for a customer who owned a ranch about an hour outside of town. The job was expected to take 3 days, and he left on a Monday morning with promises to call me every evening and be back by Thursday afternoon. Margaret had gone to stay with her sister who was recovering from surgery, leaving me alone in the house with Frank for the first time since I'd become part of the family. I should have insisted on going to stay with my own family while Robert was away, but I was still young and naive, still believing that being married meant I belonged in that house regardless of who else was there. I thought I was being mature and independent, proving that I could handle being a Crawford wife even when circumstances were less than ideal. The first night, Frank came home from work as usual, nodding at me politely as he headed upstairs to change clothes. I had dinner waiting, pot roast with vegetables the way Margaret had taught me, and I called him to the table when everything was ready. We ate in relative silence, making occasional small talk about his day at the mill and when we expected Robert to call. After dinner, I cleaned the kitchen while Frank settled into his chair with his newspaper and a beer. When Robert called around 8 o'clock, Frank barely looked up from his reading, though I noticed his newspaper never turned a page during the entire conversation. I kept my voice cheerful as I told my husband about my day, not mentioning the odd tension I felt in the house without his presence to buffer the strange energy that seemed to emanate from his father. The second night followed the same pattern, but I began to notice things that set my nerves on edge. Frank's eyes following me as I moved around the kitchen. The way he positioned himself so I had to squeeze past him to reach the stove or sink. Comments that seemed innocent on the surface but felt loaded with meaning I didn't want to understand. "You're looking pretty tonight, Dorothy," he said as I served his dinner, his voice casual but his eyes intense in a way that made me want to cover myself despite being fully clothed in a modest dress that came well below my knees. "Robert's a lucky man," he continued, cutting into his meat with more force than necessary. "Sometimes I wonder if he knows just how lucky." I mumbled something about being the lucky one, and quickly busied myself with unnecessary tasks, wiping counters that were already clean and rearranging items that didn't need rearranging. When Robert called that night, I wanted desperately to tell him I was uncomfortable, to ask him to come home early, or to let me stay with my parents until he returned. But the words wouldn't come. How could I explain a feeling, a sense of wrongness that I couldn't quite define? How could I accuse his father of something when nothing concrete had actually happened? The third night, everything fell apart. Frank came home that Wednesday evening different than the previous nights. There was something in his demeanor that immediately put me on high alert, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly what had changed. Maybe it was the way he looked at me when he walked through the door, or perhaps it was the slight stumble in his step that suggested he'd stopped somewhere for drinks after work. The lumber mill had been particularly demanding that week, with shipments running behind schedule and tempers flaring among the workers, but this felt like something more than just job stress. I had prepared his favorite meal, hoping to keep things pleasant and normal until Robert returned the next day. Meatloaf with mashed potatoes and green beans, the same recipe Margaret had taught me during my first week in their home. The kitchen smelled of comfort food and domesticity, a sharp contrast to the unease that had been building in my chest since Monday morning. During dinner, Frank's conversation was different too. Instead of the usual brief exchanges about work and weather, he began asking personal questions that made me shift uncomfortably in my chair. He wanted to know about my childhood, about boys I'd dated before Robert, about things that felt too intimate for a father-in-law to be discussing with his son's wife. His voice carried an undertone that made innocent questions feel loaded with, meaning I didn't want to understand. "You were quite the popular girl in high school, weren't you, Dorothy?" he said, not really asking, but stating it as if he'd been making inquiries about my past. His fork scraped against his plate in a way that set my teeth on edge. "Robert mentioned you had other suitors before him." I mumbled something non-committal, focusing intently on cutting my meatloaf into smaller and smaller pieces. The truth was, I'd had very few dates before Robert, mostly awkward encounters with boys from school who never called for a second outing. But something in Frank's tone suggested he wanted me to elaborate, to share details that felt far too personal for our relationship. "A girl like you must have learned a lot about keeping men happy," he continued, his eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "That's important in a marriage, you know, keeping your husband satisfied so he doesn't go looking elsewhere." The conversation felt wrong on every level, but I was trapped by politeness and my own inexperience with such situations. At 19, married for only a few months, I had no framework for understanding what was happening or how to respond. My mother had raised me to be respectful to my elders, especially family members, and the thought of being rude to Robert's father felt impossible, despite every instinct screaming at me to leave the table. After dinner, I hurried through the dishes while Frank settled into his usual chair with a beer and the evening paper. But instead of reading, he watched me work, his eyes following my movements around the kitchen in a way that made me acutely conscious of every gesture. I found myself moving more stiffly, keeping my back to him as much as possible, but the feeling of being observed never left. When Robert called that evening, I answered in the kitchen, stretching the phone cord as far as it would reach to put some distance between myself and Frank's chair. My husband's voice sounded tired but cheerful, full of stories about the ranch and the complicated engine repair that was taking longer than expected. He might need to stay an extra day, he told me, maybe until Friday afternoon depending on how the work progressed. The news hit me like a physical blow. Another night alone with Frank. Another evening of walking on eggshells and trying to navigate conversations that felt increasingly inappropriate. I wanted desperately to tell Robert about my discomfort, to beg him to come home immediately or ask if I could drive out to the ranch to stay with him. But Frank was sitting just 20 feet away, and I knew he could hear every word of our conversation. "Everything's fine here," I heard myself saying, the lie bitter on my tongue. "Your father and I are managing just fine. Take as long as you need to finish the job properly." After I hung up, Frank set down his newspaper and looked at me with what I can only describe as satisfaction. He seemed pleased by the news of Robert's delayed return, and that pleasure made my stomach twist with dread. I mumbled something about being tired and headed toward the stairs, hoping to escape to the safety of the bedroom Robert and I shared. "Dorothy," Frank's voice stopped me with my foot on the first step. "Why don't you come sit with me for a while? Keep an old man company instead of hiding upstairs like a scared rabbit." The request was phrased politely enough, but something in his tone made it clear it wasn't really a request at all. With shaking hands, I walked back to the living room and perched on the edge of the sofa, as far from his chair as I could manage while still technically complying with his demand. For a while, we sat in silence while Frank sipped his beer and pretended to read articles he'd already finished. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife, and I found myself counting the minutes until I could reasonably excuse myself for the night. But as the evening wore on, Frank's behavior became increasingly bold. He started with seemingly innocent comments about my appearance, telling me how pretty I looked even after a long day of housework, how lucky Robert was to have such a beautiful wife waiting for him at home. Then the comments became more personal, more inappropriate. He talked about marriage in ways that made my cheeks burn, sharing details about his relationship with Margaret that no daughter-in-law should ever hear. As the night progressed and Frank consumed more beer, his filter disappeared entirely. He began talking about my body in ways that made me want to run from the room, but every time I tried to excuse myself, he would call me back with some transparent excuse about needing help with something or wanting to discuss household matters that couldn't wait until morning. "You know, Dorothy," he said around 10 o'clock, his words slightly slurred but his eyes sharp and calculating, "Margaret was never much of a wife in certain ways. Always claimed she was too tired or had a headache when a man had needs. I bet you're different, though. I bet you know how to take care of a man properly." The words hung in the air like poison gas, contaminating everything they touched. I felt my face flame with embarrassment and anger, but I was still too shocked, too inexperienced with such overt harassment to know how to respond. In my family, men didn't talk to women this way. In my limited experience with dating, boys had been respectful, or at least subtle in their advances. This raw, aggressive sexuality was completely outside my realm of understanding. "I should go to bed now," I managed to whisper, standing on unsteady legs and backing toward the stairs. "It's getting late and I have cleaning to do tomorrow." Frank stood as well, and I realized with growing alarm that he was blocking my path to the staircase. He was a big man, made bigger by years of physical labor, and in that moment I became acutely aware of how small and vulnerable I was in comparison. The house suddenly felt enormous and empty, with no neighbors close enough to hear if I screamed, no one to witness whatever was about to happen. "Now hold on there," he said, his voice taking on a harder edge that sent ice through my veins. I'm not done talking to you yet. You're being awfully unfriendly to someone who's been nothing but welcoming to you in his home." He took a step closer, and I could smell the beer on his breath mixed with something else. Something predatory that made every survival instinct I possessed start screaming warnings. This was the moment I should have run, should have pushed past him and locked myself in the bedroom or escaped through the front door. But I was paralyzed by disbelief, by the surreal nature of what was happening, by my complete inability to process that my husband's father was threatening me in ways I couldn't yet fully comprehend. "You're a married woman now, Dorothy," Frank continued, moving even closer until I could feel the heat radiating from his body. "That means you have responsibilities, obligations to family. Robert's not here to take care of certain needs, but that doesn't mean those needs just disappear." I finally found my voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "I don't know what you mean. I think there's been a misunderstanding. I really need to go upstairs now." But when I tried to move around him, Frank's hand shot out and grabbed my wrist with enough force to leave bruises that would last for weeks. His grip was like a vice, and suddenly the pretense of polite conversation was completely abandoned. This was no longer inappropriate flirtation or uncomfortable comments. This was physical restraint, actual force being used against me in my own home. "Oh, I think you know exactly what I mean," he growled, his face now inches from mine. "You've been prancing around here in your little dresses, cooking my meals, playing house like some kind of innocent little girl. But you're not innocent anymore, are you, Dorothy? You're a married woman and married women have duties." I tried to pull away, but his grip only tightened. Panic was beginning to set in as I realized that my worst fears were coming true, that the uncomfortable feelings and inappropriate comments had been building to this moment all along. Frank had been testing my boundaries, seeing how far he could push before I would resist, and my politeness and inexperience had been interpreted as invitation. "Please let me go," I said, my voice stronger now as adrenaline began to override my shock. "This isn't right. You're Robert's father. This isn't right." Frank laughed, a sound completely devoid of humor or warmth. "Right and wrong don't have much to do with it, sweetheart. This is about what happens in the real world. About how families really work when the pretty facades get stripped away." His other hand reached out to touch my face, and I jerked back so violently that I lost my balance and stumbled against the wall. Frank followed, pressing his body against mine and pinning me in place with his weight. The smell of beer and sweat and something else I couldn't identify filled my nostrils, making me gag with revulsion. "This is what you wanted, isn't it?" he whispered against my ear, his breath hot and sour. "All those looks, all that sweetness and light. You've been asking for this since the day you walked into my house." The accusation was so outrageous, so completely opposite to my actual feelings and behavior, that it shocked me out of my paralysis. "No," I said firmly, pushing against his chest with both hands. "No, I never wanted this. Get away from me. Get away from me right now." But Frank was stronger than me, bigger than me, and motivated by something dark and ugly that I was only beginning to understand. My struggle seemed to excite him rather than deter him, and I realized with growing horror that my resistance was being interpreted as part of some twisted game, rather than genuine refusal. The next few minutes remained fragmented in my memory, pieces of nightmare that my mind mercifully blurred to protect my sanity. There was the sound of fabric tearing as Frank grabbed at my dress. There was the pain of being pressed against the wall with enough force to bruise my back and shoulders. There was my own voice, high and desperate, begging him to stop, to think about what he was doing, to remember that I was his son's wife. But most clearly, I remember the moment when I realized that no amount of pleading or reasoning was going to stop what was happening. Frank was beyond rational thought, driven by impulses that had probably been building since the day Robert first brought me home. This wasn't a moment of weakness or poor judgment. This was predatory behavior that had been carefully planned and executed when the opportunity arose. When I finally screamed, Frank's hand clamped over my mouth with bruising force. "Keep quiet," he hissed, his eyes wild with a combination of lust and rage that transformed his familiar features into something monstrous. "You scream again, and I'll tell Robert you came onto me. I'll tell him you've been throwing yourself at me since day one, and who do you think he'll believe?" His father, or some little tramp who trapped him into marriage. The threat was more effective than physical force could have been. Robert loved his father, respected him, had grown up believing Frank Crawford was a man of integrity and strength. If it came down to my word against his, I knew with sickening certainty who would be believed. A 19-year-old girl from the wrong side of town, or a respected mill supervisor who had built a life and reputation in this community over decades. What happened next was a violation so complete, so devastating, that even now, more than 50 years later, I struggle to find words adequate to describe it. Frank took something from me that night that I would never fully recover, something beyond just physical integrity. He stole my sense of safety, my trust in family, my belief that marriage and love could protect me from the worst impulses of men. When it was over, I lay on the living room floor where he had thrown me, my dress torn and my body aching in ways I hadn't known were possible. Frank stood over me, adjusting his clothes with the casual indifference of someone who had just completed a routine task. There was no remorse in his expression, no acknowledgement of what he had just done. If anything, he looked satisfied, as if he had finally claimed something he felt entitled to. "Clean yourself up," he said, his voice returning to the same conversational tone he'd used during dinner. "And remember what I told you about keeping quiet. Robert doesn't need to know about this, and neither does anyone else. This is just between us now, Dorothy. Just a little family matter." He walked out of the room as if nothing had happened, leaving me broken and bleeding on the carpet Margaret had vacuumed just that morning. I heard his footsteps on the stairs, heard the bedroom door close, heard the ordinary sounds of a man preparing for bed after an ordinary evening. But nothing would ever be ordinary again. I don't know how long I lay there before I found the strength to move. Time seemed suspended, divided into the before and after of my life with such brutal clarity that I felt like I was watching someone else's nightmare from a great distance. When I finally managed to sit up, every movement sent fresh waves of pain through my battered body. Getting to the bathroom required crawling part of the way, my legs too shaky to support my weight. In the harsh fluorescent light, I saw the full extent of the damage. Bruises were already forming on my wrists and arms where Frank had gripped me. My lip was split and swollen. There were other injuries, more intimate ones, that made me understand in visceral terms what violation really meant. I ran a bath as hot as I could stand, as if heat and soap could wash away what had happened. But even after scrubbing until my skin was raw, I still felt dirty, contaminated in ways that no amount of cleaning could address. The girl who had served dinner just hours earlier was gone forever, replaced by someone I didn't recognize, someone who now carried a terrible secret that threatened to destroy everything I thought I knew about my life. The hardest part was the silence. Sitting in that bathtub, staring at bruises that would need to be hidden, and dealing with pain that would need to be explained away, I realized that Frank had been right about one thing. Who would believe me? A 19-year-old newlywed accusing her respected father-in-law of rape? In 1968, in a small town where reputation meant everything, and family loyalty was sacred? The word of a mill supervisor against that of a girl from the poor side of town? Even if Robert believed me, which seemed far from certain, what then? Destroy his relationship with his father? Tear apart the family that had welcomed me? Face the shame and scandal that would follow us for the rest of our lives? In those days, victims of sexual assault were often treated as if they had brought their suffering upon themselves. I would be the one questioned, the one blamed, the one who would carry the stain of what had happened. As I sat in that cooling bathwater, I made a decision that would haunt me for decades. I would say nothing. I would pretend it never happened. I would hide the bruises, lie about the pain, and somehow find a way to survive until I could figure out how to protect myself from future attacks. Because I knew with terrible certainty that this was not a one-time occurrence. Frank had crossed a line from which there was no return, and he would expect continued access to what he now considered his property. When Robert called the next morning to say he would definitely be home by evening, I managed to sound normal, cheerful even. I told him I missed him, and was looking forward to his return, words that were true even though they came from a person who had been fundamentally changed in ways he would never know. Frank had already left for work by the time I came downstairs, but he had left evidence of his presence in ways that made my skin crawl. His coffee cup sat in the sink, still warm. The newspaper was folded to an article about a local family's anniversary celebration, as if he had been contemplating the ironies of marriage and commitment. I spent the day preparing for Robert's return with mechanical precision. I cleaned the house thoroughly, removing any trace of the previous night's horror. I prepared his favorite welcome home dinner and set the table with Margaret's good china. I practiced smiling in the bathroom mirror until the expression looked natural rather than desperate. When Robert finally walked through the door that evening, carrying flowers he had picked up at a roadside stand, I threw myself into his arms with the desperation he interpreted as romantic passion. He held me close, telling me how much he had missed me, how good it felt to be home with his beautiful wife. If he noticed that I held him a little too tightly, that my kisses tasted slightly of tears, he attributed it to the natural emotion of a young bride reunited with her husband. Frank joined us for dinner that night, playing the role of devoted father and welcoming host with such convincing normalcy that I almost questioned my own memories. He asked Robert about the repair job with genuine interest, complimented my cooking with the same casual appreciation he had shown for months, and made no reference whatsoever to the previous evening's events. It was as if he had the ability to compartmentalize his behavior so completely that the monster who had attacked me simply didn't exist in this domestic setting. But I knew better now. I caught the meaningful looks he sent my way when Robert's attention was elsewhere. I saw the satisfied smile that played around his lips when he thought no one was watching. Most disturbing of all, I recognized the proprietary way he looked at me, as if I had become his possession rather than his son's wife. That night, lying in bed next to my sleeping husband, I stared at the ceiling and tried to figure out how to survive what my life had become. Robert's breathing was deep, and even beside me, his arm thrown across my waist in the unconscious gesture of a man who felt secure in his world. He had no idea that his wife was now living in a state of constant terror, that his childhood home had become a prison, that his beloved father was a predator who saw me as available prey. The bruises would fade over the next few weeks, hidden under long sleeves and carefully applied makeup. The physical pain would gradually subside, though it would take much longer for certain activities to become comfortable again. But the psychological damage was just beginning, creating wounds that would influence every decision I made for years to come. Frank's prediction proved accurate in the most terrible way possible. He did expect continued access, viewing what had happened as the establishment of a new normal rather than an aberrant moment of violence. Over the following months, whenever Robert was away on business or working late, Frank would find opportunities to corner me, to make it clear that his appetite had been whetted rather than satisfied. The threats were rarely spoken directly, but they were always present. A hand that lingered too long on my shoulder when passing behind my chair at dinner. Comments about what a shame it would be if Robert learned about his wife's true nature. Reminders about family loyalty, and the importance of keeping private matters private. Frank had created a web of fear and manipulation that trapped me as effectively as any physical restraint. I began to live in a state of hypervigilance, constantly monitoring Robert's schedule and Frank's whereabouts, trying to avoid situations where I might be alone with my tormentor. I developed headaches and stomach problems that I attributed to the stress of adjusting to married life. I lost weight and had trouble sleeping. Changes that Robert noticed but interpreted as the normal challenges of a young woman learning to manage a household. The worst part was the isolation. I couldn't confide in my mother, who would be devastated and powerless to help. I couldn't tell my sisters, who would want to do something that would only make the situation worse. I couldn't reach out to friends, because admitting what was happening would require explanations I wasn't prepared to give. The secret Frank had forced me to carry was poisonous, eating away at my relationships and my sense of self. Margaret's return from her sister's visit brought a mixture of relief and additional complication. Her presence in the house meant fewer opportunities for Frank to corner me alone, but it also meant living with someone who I suspected knew more about her husband's true nature than she would ever admit. I watched Margaret carefully, looking for signs that she had experienced her own victimization, but she maintained such tight control over her expressions and reactions that I could never be certain. Sometimes I caught her looking at me with what might have been sympathy, or possibly just the natural concern of a mother-in-law watching a young woman struggle with the transition to married life. Other times, her gaze seemed almost knowing, as if she understood exactly what was happening but had made peace with her powerlessness to stop it. The uncertainty was almost as torturous as Frank's actual threats, because it meant I truly had no allies in the house where I was supposed to feel safe and protected. As autumn arrived and our first wedding anniversary approached, I began to hope that time might heal the situation, that Frank would lose interest, or that circumstances would change to protect me. Robert had been talking about us getting our own place soon, maybe a small apartment closer to his work, where we could start our real life together as an independent couple. The possibility of escape, even if temporary, gave me something to focus on beyond just surviving each day. But Frank had no intention of letting his new toys slip away so easily. He began inserting himself more aggressively into our marriage plans, suggesting that we save money by staying with his family longer, reminding Robert of his obligation to help with household expenses and maintenance. When Robert mentioned looking at apartments, Frank would point out problems with every option, financial concerns that seemed reasonable on the surface but felt like deliberate sabotage to me. The trap was closing around me with increasing tightness, and I was beginning to understand that passive survival would not be enough. If I wanted to reclaim my life, I would need to find the courage to fight back, regardless of the consequences. But at 19, isolated and terrified, I had no idea how to begin that fight, or where to find the weapons I would need to win it. Winter came early that year, bringing with it a cold that seemed to seep into my bones and stay there. The Crawford house, which had once felt spacious and welcoming, now felt like a maze of potential dangers. Every hallway could hide Frank waiting for me. Every moment Robert left for work meant hours of walking on eggshells, trying to anticipate and avoid situations that might give Frank opportunities to continue his campaign of terror. The holidays were approaching, and with them came the expectation of family gatherings, cheerful meals, and the performance of domestic happiness that felt increasingly impossible to maintain. Margaret threw herself into Christmas preparations with an intensity that bordered on manic, as if the perfect holiday could somehow paper over the cracks that were becoming more visible in the foundation of our family. I found myself volunteering for every errand that would take me out of the house. Grocery shopping that used to be completed in an hour now stretched into entire afternoons as I wandered the aisles of multiple stores, prolonging my freedom. I began attending weekday church services, something I had never done before, simply because it was a place Frank would never think to look for me, and where I could sit in silence among people who didn't know my secrets. The church became my sanctuary in more ways than one. Pastor Williams was a kind man in his 60s who had ministered to our community for over 20 years. He had a gentle way of speaking that made even the most troubled souls feel welcome, and his sermons often touched on themes of forgiveness, endurance, and finding strength in faith during dark times. I found myself clinging to his words like a drowning person clutches a life preserver. It was during one of these midweek services that I met Helen Morrison, a woman about 10 years older than me who attended with her 2 small children while her husband worked shifts at the railroad. Helen had a warmth about her that immediately put me at ease, and she seemed to sense something in me that needed gentle handling. After several weeks of sitting near each other and exchanging polite greetings, she invited me for coffee at the diner downtown. Helen was the first person in months who looked at me and seemed to really see me, not as Robert's wife or Frank's daughter-in-law, but as Dorothy, a young woman struggling with something she couldn't quite name. Over coffee and pie, Helen shared stories about her own early marriage, the challenges of living with in-laws, and the difficulties of finding your place in a family that had established patterns long before you arrived. I found myself opening up more than I had intended, though I was careful to keep my revelations vague and general. I spoke about feeling isolated, about the pressure to be perfect, about the sense that I was constantly being watched and judged. Helen listened without offering easy solutions or empty platitudes, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe normally. "You know, Dorothy," Helen said as we prepared to leave that first afternoon, "sometimes the hardest part about being married young is learning that you still have rights, even as a wife. You don't stop being your own person just because you took someone's name." Her words stayed with me long after we parted ways. The idea that I still had rights, that marriage didn't erase my individual worth or agency, was revolutionary to someone who had been taught that a woman's primary value lay in her ability to serve others. Helen's friendship became a lifeline, a weekly reminder that there was a world beyond the Crawford house, where I was valued for myself, rather than feared as a potential threat to family secrets. But Frank was not content to let me find even this small measure of independence. He began questioning my absences more aggressively, demanding to know where I had been and who I had spoken with. When I mentioned my friendship with Helen, his reaction was swift and unsettling. "That Morrison woman has quite a reputation for sticking her nose where it doesn't belong," he said one evening after Robert had gone upstairs to shower. "Her husband works for the railroad, you know. Good union job. It would be a shame if someone mentioned to his supervisor that his wife was spreading gossip about respectable families." The threat was clear, even though it was couched in seemingly casual conversation. Frank had the connections and influence to damage Helen's family if I continued to confide in her. The realization that my attempts to find support could result in harm to innocent people added another layer of guilt and isolation to my already overwhelming burden. I began canceling my coffee dates with Helen, making excuses about household responsibilities and family obligations. When she called to check on me, I kept the conversations brief and superficial, my answers carefully monitored since Frank had taken to hovering nearby whenever the phone rang. Helen's concerned questions about my well-being became harder to deflect, and I could hear the confusion in her voice as our friendship cooled without explanation. Christmas Day arrived with all the external trappings of joy and celebration. Margaret had decorated the house beautifully, with garland draped along the staircase and a tree that nearly touched the living room ceiling. The kitchen filled with the sense of traditional holiday cooking, and presents wrapped in careful precision waited under the tree for the family gathering that would include Robert's aunts, uncles, and cousins. I threw myself into the preparations with desperate enthusiasm, as if perfect execution of holiday traditions could somehow transform our dysfunctional family into the loving unit we pretended to be. I spent days baking cookies, helping Margaret with cleaning, and wrapping gifts with elaborate bows that required far more time and effort than necessary. The activity helped keep my mind occupied and my hands busy, making it harder for dark thoughts to take root. Robert's extended family began arriving on Christmas Eve, filling the house with laughter and conversation that almost drowned out the undercurrent of tension I had learned to live with. His Aunt Patricia was a boisterous woman who dominated conversations with stories from her job at the telephone company. Uncle James brought his harmonica and led the family in carols that made the walls ring with music. The children raced through the house with the unbridled energy that only Christmas morning can inspire. For a few hours, I allowed myself to believe that this was real, that we were actually the happy family we appeared to be to outsiders. I laughed at Uncle James's jokes, helped serve the elaborate dinner Margaret had prepared, and accepted compliments on my appearance and cooking with something approaching genuine pleasure. Robert was in his element, proud to show off his wife to relatives who had watched him grow up, and his obvious happiness made it easier to play my role convincingly. But Frank never stopped watching me, even in the midst of family celebration. I caught him staring at me across the dinner table with an intensity that made my stomach clench with familiar dread. When I got up to clear plates, his hand would brush against mine, with deliberate intimacy. When I passed behind his chair carrying serving dishes, he would lean back slightly, forcing me to press against him to get by. The worst moment came during gift opening, when Frank presented me with a gold locket that was far too personal and expensive for a father-in-law to give his daughter-in-law. The family oohed and ahhed over the beautiful jewelry, praising Frank's thoughtfulness while I sat frozen with the box in my hands, understanding the message behind the gift all too clearly. "Open it," Frank said, his eyes locked on mine with unmistakable meaning. "I think you'll find what's inside very special." With trembling fingers, I opened the locket to find a tiny photograph of Frank himself, smiling directly at the camera with the same predatory expression I had learned to fear. The symbolism was clear and devastating. He wanted me to wear his image close to my heart, to carry a constant reminder of his ownership even when surrounded by family and friends. The family interpreted my shocked silence as overwhelming gratitude, and Robert beamed with pride at his father's generosity. "Thank him properly, Dorothy," my husband encouraged, and I was forced to lean over and kiss Frank's cheek while he whispered almost inaudibly in my ear, Beautiful gifts should be treasured and protected, he murmured, his breath hot against my skin. I hope you'll take very good care of this one. That night, after the relatives had gone home and the house had settled into quiet, I lay in bed staring at the locket on my nightstand. Robert had insisted I try it on immediately, praising how lovely it looked against my skin, completely oblivious to the violation it represented. The weight of it around my neck had felt like a collar, marking me as property in a way that no one else could see but that Frank and I both understood perfectly. The new year brought with it an escalation in Frank's behavior that left me reeling, perhaps emboldened by the success of his Christmas gift and my continued silence. He began taking greater risks, pushing boundaries that had previously seemed sacred. When Robert left for work in the mornings, Frank would delay his own departure, finding excuses to linger in the kitchen while I cleaned up from breakfast. These encounters became increasingly brazen. He would stand close enough that I could feel his body heat, commenting on my appearance in ways that made my skin crawl. His hands found excuses to touch me, ostensibly helping me reach items on high shelves, or steadying me when I carried heavy loads of laundry. Each contact was brief enough to maintain plausible deniability, but intimate enough to reinforce his message of possession and control. The psychological warfare was even more devastating than the physical violations. Frank had an uncanny ability to read my emotional state and exploit my vulnerabilities with surgical precision. When I seemed to be gaining confidence, he would make subtle threats about Robert's job security, or comment on how disappointed the family would be if our marriage failed. When I appeared particularly fearful, he would affect a concerned, fatherly manner that made me question my own perceptions of his behavior. "You seem so tense lately, Dorothy," he would say with apparent concern. "Marriage can be stressful for young women. Sometimes they need someone older and more experienced to help them work through their anxieties." These conversations were masterpieces of manipulation, designed to make me doubt my own sanity, while reinforcing his position as the authority figure who held all the power in our relationship. He was particularly skilled at timing these interactions for moments when I was already feeling vulnerable or isolated, maximizing their psychological impact. Margaret's role in this dynamic remained frustratingly ambiguous. There were moments when I caught her watching Frank's interactions with me with an expression that suggested knowledge and disapproval, but she never intervened or offered support. Other times, she seemed genuinely oblivious to the undercurrents of threat and intimidation that colored every family gathering. I began to suspect that Margaret had learned to survive her own marriage by developing selective blindness, seeing only what she could safely acknowledge while turning away from truths too dangerous to confront. This realization filled me with a mixture of sympathy and frustration. If Frank's own wife couldn't or wouldn't challenge his behavior, what hope did I have of finding an ally within the family structure? The isolation was becoming unbearable. I had lost my friendship with Helen, scared away by Frank's threats. My relationship with my own family had become strained, as I struggled to maintain normal interactions while carrying such a heavy secret. My mother noticed my weight loss and pale complexion during our weekly phone calls, expressing concern that I deflected with vague explanations about adjusting to married life. Robert, bless his heart, remained completely oblivious to the transformation taking place in his wife and his household. He was working longer hours at the dealership, building his reputation and saving money for our eventual move to independent housing. His dedication to providing for our future was admirable, but it also meant more opportunities for Frank to corner me without witnesses. When Robert was home, I clung to him with a desperation he interpreted as romantic devotion. I encouraged physical intimacy not out of desire, but out of a need to feel clean, to reclaim ownership of my own body through consensual contact with the man I had chosen to marry. These encounters became both healing and painful, reminders of what intimacy should feel like while underscoring how Frank's violations had contaminated even my most private moments. The breaking point came on a Tuesday in February, when Robert had to make an unexpected trip to Los Angeles for a specialized training course that would advance his career prospects. The opportunity was too good to pass up, but it meant leaving me alone with his parents for 3 days and 2 nights. Frank's satisfaction with this arrangement was so obvious that even Margaret seemed uncomfortable, though she said nothing to intervene. I considered every possible escape route. I could claim illness, and stay with my parents, but that would require explanations I wasn't prepared to give. I could volunteer for extra shifts at a part-time job I had started at the local library, but the hours wouldn't cover the entire period of Robert's absence. I could visit relatives in another town, but that would seem strange and suspicious given the short notice. In the end, I was trapped by the same social expectations and family loyalty that had protected Frank's behavior all along. A wife's place was in her husband's home, caring for his family and maintaining the household in his absence. To do anything else would raise questions I couldn't answer, without revealing secrets that would destroy everything Robert believed about his father and his family. The first night passed without major incident, though Frank's behavior at dinner was more inappropriate than usual. He made comments about my cooking that were laden with sexual innuendo, praised my appearance in ways that made Margaret shift uncomfortably in her seat, and found excuses to touch my hand and arm that felt like public claiming rituals. I endured it all in silence, counting the hours until Robert's return would restore some measure of safety to my world. But the second night brought an escalation that shattered any remaining illusions I might have had about my ability to simply endure until circumstances changed. Frank had been drinking more heavily than usual, and Margaret had retired early with one of her frequent headaches. I was washing dishes in the kitchen when I heard his footsteps approaching from behind. The attack was more violent than anything that had come before, fueled by alcohol and months of building entitlement. Frank's behavior had the desperate quality of someone who knew his window of opportunity was closing, that Robert's return would mean the end of this particular period of access and control. The physical violation was devastating, but even worse was the psychological assault that accompanied it. "You belong to this family now," he snarled as he pinned me against the kitchen counter. "That means you belong to me when I want you." Robert doesn't need to know everything about how his wife serves his family. The words were designed to reinforce the web of shame and complicity that Frank had been weaving around me for months. He wanted me to believe that I was somehow responsible for his actions, that my presence in his house constituted consent to whatever he chose to do to me. Most insidiously, he wanted me to accept that this was simply how families worked, that wives were property to be shared among male relatives when convenient. When it was over, I found myself on the kitchen floor once again, my dress torn and my body screaming with pain and violation. But something had changed in me during those terrible minutes. The girl who had accepted her fate in silent terror was gone, replaced by a woman who finally understood that survival would require action rather than just endurance. Frank stood over me, adjusting his clothes with the same casual indifference he had shown after the first attack, but this time I didn't simply lie there waiting for him to leave. This time I looked up at him with eyes that he must have recognized as different, more dangerous than they had been before. "You can't keep doing this," I said, my voice steady despite the pain radiating through my body. "Someone will find out. Someone will stop you." Frank laughed, but there was something forced about the sound, as if my newfound defiance had caught him off guard. "Who's gonna stop me, sweetheart? Your husband who thinks I walk on water. His mother who's spent 30 years pretending not to see what she doesn't want to know. Your own family who would be scandalized to learn what kind of woman their precious daughter really is." But even as he spoke the words that were meant to reinforce my powerlessness, I could see a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Something in my demeanor had shifted, and predators like Frank were skilled at reading their victims for signs of changing dynamics. The absolute certainty of my helplessness that had protected him for months was beginning to crack, and we both knew it. As I slowly picked myself up from the kitchen floor and began the familiar ritual of cleaning away evidence of what had happened, I was already making plans. Frank had finally overplayed his hand, pushed me past the point of passive endurance into active resistance. The war for my life and dignity was far from over, but the first battle was about to begin. The next morning brought an unexpected gift in the form of clarity. As I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, cataloging the fresh bruises and trying to determine how to hide them before Robert's return, I realized that something fundamental had shifted inside me. The face looking back from the reflection belonged to someone who had finally stopped asking why me and started asking what now. I had spent months believing that I was trapped, that my only options were to endure or to destroy my marriage by telling Robert the truth about his father. But staring at my reflection that morning, I understood that those weren't the only choices available to me. There were other paths, other ways to reclaim power, in a situation designed to render me powerless. The first step was documentation. Frank's confidence in my silence had made him careless, and I intended to use that carelessness against him. I began keeping a detailed diary, hidden beneath the lining of my jewelry box, where even Margaret's thorough cleaning wouldn't uncover it. Every inappropriate comment, every threatening gesture, every moment of violation was recorded with dates, times, and circumstances. Writing down what was happening to me served multiple purposes. It provided concrete evidence that would be harder to dismiss than my word alone. It helped me process the trauma by putting it into words rather than carrying it as unnamed horror. Most importantly, it gave me back a sense of agency, transforming me from passive victim to active documenter of crimes that would eventually demand justice. I also began reaching out carefully to rebuild the support network that Frank had systematically destroyed. Helen Morrison had continued to call occasionally, her concern evident even through my evasive responses. When she invited me to coffee again, I accepted, but this time I chose a location far from Bakersfield, in a neighboring town where Frank's influence and connections couldn't reach. Sitting across from Helen in that small diner, I made a decision that terrified and liberated me in equal measure. I told her everything, not the vague hints and careful omissions I had been offering for months, but the full, brutal truth about what my life had become since marrying into the Crawford family. Helen listened without judgment, her face growing pale as the scope of Frank's behavior became clear. When I finished, Helen reached across the table and took my hands in hers. "Dorothy," she said quietly, "this isn't your fault. None of this is your fault, and you don't have to carry it alone anymore." Those words were like water to someone dying of thirst. For months I had been drowning in shame and self-doubt, wondering if somehow I had brought this nightmare upon myself. Helen's absolute certainty that I was the victim rather than the cause began to chip away at the foundation of guilt that Frank had so carefully constructed. Helen's husband worked for the railroad, which meant he traveled regularly to larger cities, where resources unavailable in Bakersfield might be found. Through his connections, Helen learned about organizations that helped women in dangerous situations, legal advocates who specialized in cases involving family violence, and even safe houses where women could stay while planning their escape from abusive relationships. The information was overwhelming at first. The idea that there were people whose job it was to help women like me seemed almost too good to be true. But as Helen brought me pamphlets and phone numbers, as she shared stories of other women who had escaped seemingly impossible situations, I began to believe that my nightmare might actually have an ending. The challenge was timing and strategy. I couldn't simply disappear one day without destroying Robert's life and leaving him with questions that would torture him forever. Despite everything his father had done to me, I still loved my husband deeply. He was an innocent victim in this situation, and I owed him the truth even if that truth would shatter his world. But telling Robert the truth required careful preparation. I needed evidence he couldn't dismiss, support systems in place to help us both deal with the aftermath, and a plan for what would happen after the revelation destroyed his relationship with his father. Frank was not the kind of man who would accept exposure quietly, and I had to be prepared for retaliation that could take many forms. I began documenting Frank's behavior more systematically, noting patterns in his aggression that corresponded to times when he had been drinking or when work stress was particularly high. I learned to position myself near windows when possible during his attacks, hoping that visible bruises might eventually provide the physical evidence I needed. Most importantly, I started confiding in Helen's contacts, building a network of people who knew my story and could provide testimony if legal action became necessary. The psychological toll of this double life was enormous. During the day, I continued to play the role of dutiful daughter-in-law and loving wife, cooking meals, cleaning house, and making conversation as if nothing had changed. But every evening, I would lock myself in the bathroom and write furiously in my hidden diary, recording each new violation and threat while the details were still fresh. Robert's return from Los Angeles brought both relief and new complications. He was excited about the training he had received and the opportunities it might create for advancement. His happiness and optimism were painful to witness, knowing what I would eventually have to tell him about his father. But his presence in the house also meant a temporary reprieve from Frank's more aggressive behavior. Frank seemed to sense that something had changed in me during Robert's absence. He was more cautious in his approaches, more subtle in his threats, but he also seemed determined to reassert his dominance, as if he recognized that his window of unchallenged control was closing. The psychological warfare intensified, with Frank finding new ways to remind me of my vulnerability while maintaining the facade of concerned father-in-law. One particularly cruel tactic involved undermining my relationship with Robert through subtle manipulation. Frank would make offhand comments about my behavior when Robert wasn't around, suggesting that I seemed unhappy or ungrateful for the family's generosity. He would ask leading questions about our marriage, implying that perhaps I wasn't as committed to the relationship as Robert believed. These manipulations were designed to plant seeds of doubt in Robert's mind, while positioning Frank as the wise patriarch looking out for his son's best interests. The strategy was particularly insidious because it used Robert's love for me against both of us, making him scrutinize my behavior for signs of problems that existed only in his father's fabricated narrative. I began to understand that Frank's abuse was not just sexual but also psychological and strategic. He was attempting to isolate me from all sources of support, including my own husband, while positioning himself as the sole authority on my character and behavior. The goal was complete control, the transformation of me into someone so dependent on his approval and terrified of his disapproval that resistance would become impossible. But the documentation I was gathering and the support network I was building were giving me weapons to fight back with. Through Helen's contacts, I learned about the legal protections available to women in my situation, though these were limited in the late 1960s. I also learned about the tactics that abusers commonly used and how to counter them effectively. One of the most important lessons was about the nature of shame and secrecy. Frank's power over me depended entirely on my willingness to keep his crimes hidden. Every day I remained silent was another day he could point to as evidence of my complicity if I ever tried to expose him. But every piece of evidence I gathered, every person I confided in, was a crack in the wall of secrecy that protected him. The breakthrough came in early spring when Frank made a critical error in judgment. Robert had left early for work, but returned unexpectedly to retrieve some documents he had forgotten. He entered the house quietly, intending to surprise me with a quick kiss goodbye before heading back to the dealership. Instead, he found his father cornering me in the laundry room, his hands on my body in ways that no father-in-law should ever touch his son's wife. Robert's face went through a series of expressions that I will never forget. First, confusion, as his mind struggled to process what he was seeing. Then disbelief, as he tried to find an innocent explanation for what was clearly an inappropriate situation. Finally, a dawning horror as the truth became undeniable. "Dad, what are you doing?" Robert asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Frank immediately shifted into damage control mode, stepping back from me and attempting to reframe the situation as innocent misunderstanding. "I was just helping Dorothy reach the detergent on the high shelf," he said smoothly. "You know how short she is, can barely reach anything up there." But Robert wasn't stupid, and he had seen enough to know that reaching for detergent didn't require the kind of contact he had witnessed. His eyes moved from his father to me, taking in my disheveled appearance, my obvious distress, and the fear that I couldn't quite hide despite months of practice. "Dorothy," Robert said carefully, "is everything all right?" It was the moment I had been preparing for, the opportunity I had been building toward, through weeks of documentation and network building. But standing there in that laundry room, with Frank's eyes boring into me, and decades of conditioning telling me to protect family harmony at all costs, I almost lost my nerve. Then I thought about the diary hidden in my jewelry box, about Helen's unwavering support, about all the other women who might suffer if Frank's behavior continued unchecked. I thought about the choice between protecting Robert's illusions and protecting his future wife from the same fate I had endured. "No," I said quietly, looking directly at my husband. "Everything is not all right, and it hasn't been all right for a very long time." Frank's face darkened with rage, but before he could speak, I continued. "Robert, I need to tell you something about your father. Something that's been happening since shortly after we were married. Something I should have told you months ago." The words hung in the air like a challenge thrown down between two armies. Frank's expression was murderous. But there was also something else there, something that looked almost like relief. The game of cat and mouse that had dominated our relationship for so many months was finally coming to an end. And even the predator seemed tired of the hunt. Robert looked between his father and me with growing understanding and horror. His face was pale, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. When he spoke, his voice was steady but filled with a pain that cut me to the heart. "Tell me," he said simply. "Tell me everything." And so I did. Standing in that laundry room with the smell of soap and the sound of the washing machine providing an incongruously domestic backdrop, I told my husband the truth about his father. I told him about the inappropriate comments, the threatening behavior, the physical violations that had escalated over months of silence. I told him about the fear that had consumed my life, the shame that had isolated me, and the desperate hope that somehow I could protect him from this knowledge while still protecting myself. Frank tried to interrupt several times, offering explanations and denials that became increasingly desperate as my account continued. But Robert silenced him with a look that contained more authority than I had ever seen my gentle husband display. When I finished, the silence stretched between us like a chasm that could never be fully bridged. Robert turned to his father with an expression I had never seen before. "Get out," he said quietly. "Now, son," Frank began, but Robert cut him off. "Get out of this house right now. Pack whatever you need and leave. Don't come back until I decide what to do about this." Frank's face cycled through several emotions: rage, disbelief, and finally a calculating coldness that was more frightening than his anger. "You'll regret this," he said, his voice low and threatening. "Both of you will regret this more than you can imagine." But Robert had heard enough. With a strength I didn't know he possessed, he grabbed his father by the arm and physically escorted him toward the door. The sound of Frank's truck starting and driving away was like the lifting of a curse that had held our house in its grip for far too long. When Robert returned to the laundry room, I was sitting on the floor, overwhelmed by the enormity of what had just happened. He knelt beside me and pulled me into his arms, holding me while I cried tears that had been held back for months. We stayed there for a long time, surrounded by the ordinary sounds of domestic life while our world remade itself around this new and terrible truth. The weeks that followed Frank's expulsion from our home were both the most difficult and the most healing of my young life. Robert struggled with a grief that was unlike anything either of us had experienced before. He wasn't just mourning the loss of his father, but the destruction of everything he had believed about the man who had raised him. The father he had looked up to, respected, and tried to emulate had never really existed except in carefully constructed lies. Margaret's reaction was perhaps the most heartbreaking of all. When Robert finally confronted her about what she might have known or suspected, her facade of perfect housewife finally cracked completely. Through tears that seemed to have been held back for decades, she admitted that she had suspected Frank's true nature for years, but had felt powerless to stop him or protect anyone from his predatory behavior. "I was so young when we married," she whispered, sitting at our kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. "He was charming then, or I thought he was. By the time I understood what kind of man he really was, Robert was born and I had nowhere to go, no way to support myself and a baby." Her admission opened floodgates of guilt and regret that had been building for 30 years. She had watched Frank's inappropriate behavior toward me, had recognized the signs from her own experience, but had been paralyzed by the same social constraints and economic realities that had trapped her in her own marriage. The revelation that we had both been victims, separated by a generation but united in our powerlessness, created a bond between us that became the foundation for both our healing. Robert threw himself into making amends for what his family had done to me. He arranged for us to move immediately into our own apartment, a small but clean place near downtown Bakersfield, where we could begin building a life free from the shadows of his father's crimes. He insisted on paying for therapy sessions with a counselor in Los Angeles, driving me there weekly despite the expense and the time away from work. The therapy was difficult, but transformative. Dr. Elizabeth Watson was a woman in her 40s, who specialized in what was then called family trauma, though the resources available for treating such cases were limited compared to what exists today. She helped me understand that the shame I carried belonged to Frank, not to me, and that my survival instincts had been healthy responses to an impossible situation rather than character flaws. More importantly, Dr. Watson introduced me to other women who had survived similar experiences. In group sessions held in her office, I met wives, daughters, and sisters who had endured various forms of family violence and violation. Hearing their stories and sharing my own began to chip away at the isolation that had been one of Frank's most effective weapons against me. One woman in our group, Sarah, had been abused by her brother-in-law for years before finding the courage to speak out. Another, Maria, had endured her stepfather's attacks throughout her teenage years before escaping through an early marriage that turned out to be its own nightmare. Each story was different in its details but similar in its themes of power, control, and the particular cruelty that comes from betrayal by those who are supposed to protect us. These women became my teachers in ways that went far beyond what any formal education could have provided. They showed me how to transform pain into purpose, how to use the strength developed through survival for helping others who were still trapped in their own nightmares. They demonstrated that healing wasn't about forgetting or forgiving, but about reclaiming the parts of ourselves that had been stolen and using them to build something meaningful from the wreckage. Through this network of survivors, I learned about volunteer opportunities with organizations that helped women escape dangerous situations. I started small, answering phones at a crisis hotline one evening per week, but the work fed something in my soul that had been starving for months. Every call I took from a frightened woman, every resource I was able to provide, felt like a small victory against the forces that had once seemed so overwhelming. Frank, meanwhile, had not disappeared quietly into the night, as we had initially hoped. After several weeks of ominous silence, he began a campaign of harassment designed to pressure us into withdrawing our accusations and allowing him to return to the family. Anonymous phone calls in the middle of the night, threatening letters with no return address. Rumors spread throughout the community about my mental instability and Robert's disloyalty to his own father. The pressure was intense and relentless. Frank still had connections throughout Bakersfield, friends who believed his version of events and were willing to help him destroy our credibility. There were mornings when I woke up to find our car tires slashed, evenings when we returned home to discover our apartment had been broken into, though nothing was taken. The message was clear. Frank wanted us to know that we were never truly safe as long as we continued to oppose him. But we had resources now that I hadn't possessed during those months of silent suffering. Dr. Watson helped us document the harassment and connected us with legal advocates who specialized in protecting victims of family violence. Helen Morrison and her husband provided both emotional support and practical assistance, including temporary housing when the threats against our apartment became too severe to ignore. Most importantly, I had Robert's unwavering support. My husband had initially struggled with guilt about his failure to protect me from his father, but Dr. Watson helped him understand that Frank's behavior had been carefully hidden from everyone, including his own son. Robert's guilt transformed into determination to ensure that Frank faced consequences for his actions and could never harm another woman the way he had harmed me. The legal battle was long and exhausting. In 1969, laws protecting women from sexual assault by family members were limited and rarely enforced. Proving emotional and psychological abuse was even more difficult, requiring testimony from mental health professionals who were willing to challenge prevailing social attitudes about family privacy and women's credibility. But we persisted, supported by a growing network of advocates who saw our case as an opportunity to establish important precedents. The trial was a media sensation in our small community, dividing families and friendships along lines that reflected broader social tensions about changing gender roles and family structures. Some people supported us, recognizing the courage it had taken to speak out against such a powerful figure in the community. Others sided with Frank, viewing our accusations as attacks on traditional family values and masculine authority. The verdict, when it finally came, was mixed. Frank was convicted on several charges related to sexual assault and harassment, but received a sentence that reflected the era's reluctance to severely punish family violence. He served 18 months in county jail and was required to undergo psychological counseling, though whether he actually participated meaningfully in that process remained questionable. More important than the legal outcome was the personal transformation that Robert and I underwent during those difficult months. We learned to communicate about painful topics that many couples never have to address. We developed a level of trust and intimacy that was forged in the fires of shared trauma and mutual support. We discovered that love could survive even the most devastating revelations when both partners were committed to healing rather than hiding. By 1971, we had established a new life that bore little resemblance to the one we had imagined when we first married. Robert had used the skills learned from his father's betrayal to become an advocate for other families dealing with similar crises. I had returned to school, pursuing a degree in social work that would allow me to help other women escape the kinds of situations I had survived. Our work brought us into contact with a national movement that was beginning to recognize domestic and sexual violence as serious social problems requiring systematic solutions. We traveled to conferences where survivors, advocates, and researchers shared strategies for supporting victims and preventing future abuse. We helped establish the first shelter for battered women in our county, using our own experience to design programs that addressed both immediate safety needs and long-term healing goals. The house we eventually bought was small but filled with light, surrounded by a garden where I grew flowers that bloomed in every season. We never had children, a decision influenced by the trauma I had experienced but one we made together without regret. Instead, we became surrogate parents to dozens of young women who passed through our shelter and support programs, offering them the safety and encouragement they needed to rebuild their lives. Margaret lived with us during her final years, having finally found the courage to divorce Frank after our trial made his true nature undeniably public. She spent those years making amends for her silence, volunteering at the shelter, and sharing her story with other women who had remained trapped in abusive marriages out of fear and economic necessity. Her transformation from silent victim to vocal advocate was one of the most inspiring aspects of our collective healing journey. Frank died in 1985, alone and largely forgotten except by those of us who bore the scars of his cruelty. I felt no satisfaction at his passing, but I did feel a sense of completion, as if a chapter that had remained open too long was finally closing. By then I had helped hundreds of women escape situations similar to the one I had endured, and each success felt like a victory over the man who had once seemed so powerful and untouchable. Today, at 75, I look back on that terrified 19-year-old girl with both compassion and admiration. She endured horrors that would have broken many people, but she also found within herself resources of strength and resilience that she never knew existed. The scars remain, and probably always will, but they have become sources of wisdom rather than shame, tools for helping others rather than weights that hold me back. The work continues, even though I am no longer able to be as actively involved as I once was. The shelter Robert and I helped establish has grown into a comprehensive resource center, serving 3 counties. The legal protections available to women today are far stronger than anything we could have imagined in 1969. The social attitudes that once protected predators like Frank have shifted dramatically, though not as completely as any of us would like. If my story has taught me anything, it is that healing is possible even from the most devastating betrayals, that love can survive even the most brutal tests, and that speaking truth to power, no matter how frightening, is always worth the risk. The girl who thought her life was over at 19 became a woman who helped change the world for countless others, and that transformation began with the simple but revolutionary act of refusing to remain silent. To anyone listening who might be facing their own nightmare, remember this: you are stronger than you know, you deserve better than what you are receiving, and there are people who will believe you and help you when you find the courage to reach out. Your story matters, your pain is real, and your future can be different from your past if you are willing to fight for it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.